there's almost like layers of the ways in which our long, hard fought rights
Mhm.
are being scaled back. And it feels very coordinated.
Federalization of the system is not solving problems, it's creating more issues and more problems. Many would think intentionally in order to remove people from being able to vote, right? And the fight is not over. It's something that continues, but it takes everybody to think about what is the piece that I can do.
Hello, this is The Current from the Brookings Podcast Network. I'm Keon Gilbert, Senior Fellow in Governance Studies and Director of the Race, Prosperity, and Inclusion Initiative here at Brookings. I'm joined today by two scholars and colleagues, Tonantzin Carmona, Fellow at Brookings Metro, and with Jonathan Cox, Vice President of the Center for Policy Analysis and Research at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Welcome to you both.
Thank
Thank you for joining us for this conversation. Our conversation today is centered on executive power and executive overreach. It's been noted by a number of scholars that executive power has been expanding for over 100 years. The Brennan Center notes that its growth accelerated after 9/11 on national security issues, and now the Trump administration is claiming further authority for the executive branch, attempting to push far beyond what the Constitution prescribes. So that sort of helps to frame our conversation for today. Part of this work is also to recognize some of the incredible work, not only of our scholars, but in particular of the CBCF, who have been tracking a number of executive orders and their impact on Black communities and other communities of color. And so that also helps to sort of set the tone and set the stage for our conversation today. We're going to begin with Jonathan Cox talking a little bit about the executive order tracker that the CBCF has developed.
Sure. Yeah, happy to share about that. Thank you, Keon. So one of the things that we did with the foundation is we were really trying to be thoughtful around the all the flurry of activity that came out of the presidential administration once President Trump returned to office. Right, all the executive orders that came out, knowing that these were going to be things that were shifting the landscape of federal policy and how the government operates, how what life looks like for people. And so in thinking about how we could be most useful, we decided that it would be great to provide a mechanism to track what the executive orders are that are being put out that have the most significant impacts on Black communities, and be able to break those executive orders down in very plain, simple to understand language for people, so they know like what it is, how it would be enforced, what would be the impacts on Black communities, and then for us also what are members of the Congressional Black Caucus saying and doing in response.
Great. And we certainly thank you all for putting this together. It's an incredible, useful resource. Tanantzin, how would this be used for some of your work? What's your response to this tracker?
Sure. So, my research focuses on wealth and inequality, a little bit on financial technologies, but a lot on also state and local government work. And so, to kind of translate what is happening federally to local communities and vice versa, I'm constantly looking at legislation, executive orders, the laws. And so, when I saw this tracker, I just thought, oh my God, thank you. This is amazing. As a researcher, it has everything in one place, but I love that you kind of took away some of the legalese and said, boil it down very simply. This is exactly what it does, and this is what it means for Black communities. And I just think that piece to me really stood out because whether you're a policy person, a policy staffer, a researcher, or even a member of an advocacy group, a community organization, at the end of the day, why a lot of us do this work is because we care about the impact to people. And so I really love that it was organized, it all in one place, but it's really boiling down to the things that really matter.
And Jonathan, I'm curious, what has been the response from members of the Congressional Black Caucus and sort of the broader community to the executive order tracker?
Sure. The response has been overwhelmingly positive, right? Again, I think because of the way in which we put it together, people see it as a resource that, again, is very easy to understand, right? It breaks down very complex language that the executive orders were written in and brings it right to the people so they understand. So members of the CBC are very grateful, obviously, because they can share this with their constituents around executive orders, executive actions, and the impacts that they might see in their communities. But then also because we are uniquely pointing out what CBC themselves are saying, right, then it lets them, again, let their constituents and others know that, I'm not just sitting by waiting while things are happening. We are engaging in work. We are responding to what's going on. We are continuing to put forth legislation that will improve lives or counter some of the negative harms that we're seeing build up from the executive actions.
Yeah, I think it's really important that you've included voices and responses from elected officials. We often, hear from them in, sound bites or TV interviews, and they may not always be responding to something explicit executive order or explicit policy. Sometimes some of those conversations are very broad. So I think it's really important that communities and constituents get to hear directly from their elected officials. One of our topics for discussion this today is to talk about voting rights and democracy. There has been a Supreme Court decision, the Voting Rights Act, which was put into place in 1965, several months after Bloody Sunday attack on civil rights marchers in Selma, Alabama. Been about 6 decades. And this has been one of the most consequential laws in the nation's history, preventing discrimination against people of color at the ballot box and helping to elect thousands of Black and Hispanic representatives at all levels of government. The Supreme Court striking down a voting map in Louisiana, and with it dealing a blow to this landmark civil rights law, has opened the door for states to redraw their congressional maps in ways that could affect elections for years. And so, with part of that backdrop, what is your response to the Supreme Court's decision?
I mean, obviously, it's overwhelmingly negative, right? When I think about the discussion that we're engaging in today, connected to the executive orders, right? I'm just thinking about the ways in which a lot of these executive actions, the consequences of these and the impacts of these are going to be exacerbated even further by this recent SCOTUS ruling, right? Again, pulling back decades of hard-won victories around voting rights is just going to make it more difficult for marginalized communities, in particular Black and brown communities, to be able to vote, right? Looking at what the potential impacts are going to be, and one of them that comes in mind immediately, particularly as connected to the work we do with the Congressional Black Caucus, is that the potential for loss, the significant loss of a number of Black representatives that
Mhm.
exists in the United States Senate and in the House of Representatives, right? We're likely going to see the biggest drop in that we've seen since Reconstruction, right? In history, since we now have the largest number of Black representatives.
I would just say, yeah, it was incredibly disappointing. And I was looking for actually some of the responses from the members of the Congressional Black Caucus. And to me, it was interesting that it's like you suffer these losses, but the work also must continue. And so I think something that was giving me a little bit of hope right now was also the renewed calls for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. There were also this, I think, to me, putting my state and local hat on is now thinking forward, what does that look like to make sure that we are impacting like state elections now, like really paying attention to secretaries of states, state AGs, state legislators, because they play an important role in our maps. And so I want to say that I am shocked, but I think right now with everything that's been happening, it was just more like a blow. Like it's like all you can feel is, oh my gosh, all this like progress that was made, completely like gutting Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is a huge loss, but the work must continue. And I think that I kind of want to make sure that whatever I can do as a researcher, like support that more forward-looking work now.
Yeah. And I'm curious in terms of part of some of the work that needs to continue. So there are several issues and concerns sort of with the idea of sort of reducing access to voting and in particular to our ideas of a more inclusive democracy. Lots of conversations and discussions about citizenship requirements and even federal voter verification systems to create a number of sort of ways that limit access to voting. And so, what have you all been learning about either state, local movements to try to counter or to deal with some of these challenges?
On the voting end, I think obviously it's like state legislators, like Secretary of State, state AGs, what you can do. Local level to me was interesting because I ended up working on a project years ago to create a Chicago municipal ID, so a local level ID. And the idea came from the fact that there are a lot of populations that lack access to identification. And I think that just showed me so much of what we can take for granted if we have access to identification. But I think then that connection to voting becomes so much more important now, in that there's almost like layers of the ways in which our rights and long, hard fought rights
Mhm.
are being scaled back. And there's like a coordination of how do we use every single lever to roll back some of those rights. So we have SCOTUS, now we have these executive orders. The ID piece is a huge piece because it seems like, oh, it's just a technicality of like, your proof of citizenship or whatnot. But I mean, there are about 21 million voting age Americans who don't have readily available proof of citizenship. I mean,
Mhm.
that's massive.
Mhm.
And so this is something that I think goes back to, taking away like voting rights and whatnot of Black Americans. Right now, it's being tied to immigrants, but I also think of women that will get impacted by some of these executive orders and then laws that are being tied to this. So it's a lot to track, but I think more than anything, what I'm just aware of is that it feels very coordinated.
Mhm. Definitely coordinated. We've known some of this has been coming, and so you're starting to see opportunity for states, right? Some of those local municipalities to try to enact things that would create positive change. Because yeah, any new requirements around identification or the citizenship, right, are simply going to create additional
Right.
barriers for people to be able to vote. They're going to make it harder, right? Like was already said, thinking about something like a passport, folks just don't have. It's expensive to get. It takes a long time to get it in the first place. When you're applying for it, only about one third of Black Americans, or one in three Black Americans, have a passport, right? So we're looking at reduced access for folks there. The birth certificates, right? The assumption that people should be able to, one, have access to and carry around their birth certificate at all times, which is preposterous on many levels. The idea that you're going to carry this around just doesn't make sense. People might, and older Americans, other marginalized groups don't even have access
Young people, yeah.
to these materials, right? College students on campuses don't have access to these physical things. So you're just creating another barrier for people to be able to get to the ballot box, right? To cast their vote, and which is extremely problematic. It's just going to continue to disenfranchise eligible voters.
And part of even some, concerns with the EO tracker, raising questions about data security, data privacy, that certainly becomes a very important part in terms of thinking about, whether it's voter IDs or,
Just
the
basic things.
federalization
Yeah.
of voting. Any other, concerns or that you want to raise?
I mean, just that idea you just talked about, right? This federalization of the voting infrastructure and elections in this country just creates significant problems, right? Some of those we've already seen. Some of those we can surmise based upon like analyzing what the executive orders are and how the administration has been acting thus far, right? So a lot of the things we're seeing with that are increased risks of errors in terms of voter eligibility, right? So how do you verify that people are citizens? Those different things, right? Some of that is a lot of that's being done online, which brings up questions around people's access to broadband, the high-speed internet, right? That's just one aspect of that. We know that some of the systems that have been in place have already to date misidentified people and classified them as non-citizens when they actually in fact were citizens, and thus dropped them from voting rolls, right?
Mhm.
So again, this federalization of the system is not solving problems, it's creating more issues and more problems, many would think intentionally, in order to remove people from being able to vote, right? And we
So
think about the fact that like Black folks are one of the most stalwart voting blocks, particularly for Democrats, right, in history.
So I want to turn to the theme of immigration. In what ways could the expansion of federal enforcement powers across immigration and criminal justice intensify existing racial disparities for communities of color and other marginalized groups, both as program beneficiaries and as subjects of enforcement? And so I'm going to turn to you first, Tanez.
my work, I guess I've started doing more work on immigration recently, but I did this mostly in local context. And in that experience, you learn that Black immigrants are more likely to be stopped, detained, or deported than non Black immigrants. Right now, we have about 5 million Black immigrants in the United States. And I think such a clear example of the way federal like role in this can play out and exacerbate the issue like comes down to like the example of Minneapolis. It's no wonder that, Minneapolis was, targeted with increased aggressive immigration enforcement. And some of the ways that they justified it was because of prominent Black immigrant community, Somali immigrants. But one part of it that worries me is the way that local policing is going to increase its role in federal immigration enforcement. So if you think about why Black immigrants are more likely to be stopped or detained, it's because it takes place with local policing. A regular traffic stop can now, because of this expansion, quickly turn into immigration enforcement. You missed your taillights, they stop you, they ask, what's your status? That gets you into trouble. And so I'm mainly just worried because it is expanding very rapidly and it goes beyond just federal actions.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with all that, right? The increased interaction with law enforcement is a significant problem for Black communities. We know that the outcomes of that interaction with police for Black folks is usually not good, right? Higher rates of death, injury, right, et cetera. And so we know that's a problem. I also think about the fact that, due to what's been happening around like immigration and how that's the shifting federal power around this, there are fewer pathways to citizenship, right, for Black immigrants. 1 in 5 Black people in America or Black Americans are either immigrants or children of immigrants, right? So that's a lot of folks that we think about having a pathway to the United States.
Some of the concerns about, immigration enforcement being a better coordinated effort with local law enforcement has kind of turned into maybe the darker side in terms of some of the things that you raise in the sense of more stop and frisk as just an example. And, how does this continue to erode our civil liberties, privacy concerns, and sort of the day-to-day treatment of Black and brown residents?
I think, public safety as we understand it is definitely changing because of immigration enforcement. When I do interviews with community groups, individuals, it was interesting in one of my conversations, they were talking about how they fear going out. And I was thinking gun violence, and they're like, no, ICE. And so just like the fact that what we consider safety is changing for so many communities is really important. How we understand that, I think we should be paying attention to how we understand safety. But none of this is helping us to feel safer or to feel freer. And I think I worry about like the lineage between what is happening and like feeling like we're in a more like authoritarian type government.
A lot of this is also connected to accessibility of data, which is a big problem because the expansion of power essentially gave access to federal agents, particularly with like DHS
Yep.
and these other orgs, to have access to information they did not have access to before, like the criminal records of United States citizens, which they now have the ability to share with foreign entities. Right. So again, that brings up huge data privacy issues and concerns around the information that they just were not able to access before and what they can do with that and how that they can be leveraged against marginalized communities, Black and brown people in particular.
Tonantzin, I want to come back to you just for a second because you raised this concern about public safety and the idea that, in particular, Latino communities, immigrant communities are changing their behaviors in lots of different ways. And so some of your work is also focused on the impact of immigration enforcement on small businesses and entrepreneurship. Can you say more about that?
So I have been tracking a few things when it comes to immigration enforcement and small business. So it was tariffs, immigration enforcement, and small business supports. I did not originally think that those are going to be the things I was going to study, but in fact, I interviewed small businesses in local chambers to see what are your challenges, what are the things you're encountering, and this was months ago. And they kept bringing up those three issues. And so you fast forward, and all of a sudden, the immigration enforcement kind of comes front and center, and people are starting to note the way that it impacts business corridors, foot traffic. People don't feel safe coming out. Workers are afraid to show up to work. And then businesses not only have to encounter that, they are trying to plan for tariffs and then the small business programs. And so I've been doing this series on that piece of it, where I think it is really interesting, and I actually appreciated seeing in the tracker is the piece about small business supports. So, here we have this like push around anti like DEI measures.
Mhm.
And so something that businesses are also having to encounter is the way that programs that support either small business support or access to capital or procurement is being incredibly altered right now. So they're managing all of this stuff on the ground. And then anything that maybe would have served as a stabilizer is being dismantled. And when those executive orders happen at the federal level, state level now is just starting to say, well, we don't want our funding to get cut. So we're also going to cut our own procurement and capital programs that support specifically Black owned, minority owned businesses at the state level. One of the things that you mentioned on your tracker, and I loved it, it was in the fact sheet, it was the way that the those like that anti-DEI executive order would then look at specifically procurement and specifically the 8A program, which is supposed to support businesses getting mentorship, technical assistance, and access to certain federal government contracts. That started under Congressman Perrin Mitchell, also a founding member of the CBC. And the idea was to support what like Black entrepreneurs from accessing federal contracts and other entrepreneurs of color. And so now you fast forward and very similarly, it's like all these programs that happened after the civil rights are now getting gutted. And so that was just an area I was not anticipating going because I was like immigration, tariffs, but then the small business supports that people rely on to build wealth, to advance, those are also getting gutted in the small business space.
Yeah, what has been some of the responses from CBCF and CBC members about how this is affecting entrepreneurship in Black communities?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that we did, we actually put out some research towards the end of last year and pushed that again at the beginning of this year around job loss, right? So when we think about economic mobility for Black people, we can think about the federal workforce, right? Black people make up a large chunk of the federal workforce, right? Almost a fifth of the federal workforce as of 2023. And so what we've seen as a result of some of the executive actions and these anti-DI policies are the cutting of jobs for Black people in the federal government. The people who have seen it the worst are Black women,
Mhm.
right? Almost 100,000 jobs, over 95,000 positions that were held by Black female federal workers were cut. They lost these jobs. They were no longer in these positions. And that was the most significant decline that we've seen for Black women in the federal workforce. It was compared like over 33%, I believe, as compared to like 3 or 4% of the overall federal workforce that
Wow.
was lost. Right. So significant impact for Black people. And that's important because, again, if we think about the ways in which the federal government has been a space historically through previous legislation that allowed for Black people to have a pathway into economic stability through these government jobs, that is being removed. So they no longer have that pathway that impacts job security. It impacts their ability to hold and maintain positions, right? So that is really problematic. So members of the CBC are really pushing forward on legislation to try to account for that. They're really calling out the impacts of that, right? Because they see it, they're living in these spaces, working in these federal positions as well. So those are some of the things that we are monitoring is what are the impacts of this on job loss and economic security for Black communities.
The executive order tracker itself is can be thought of as a teaching tool or an information tool. When we think about sort of a lot of the backlash and sort of anti-DEI efforts and how that is affecting civil rights, what are some of the consequences for opportunity and representation that you are, sort of noticing in other areas, whether it's healthcare, other sectors that we should be thinking about?
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm glad you mentioned the workforce because like the workforce to me was important, small business, because it's really economic.
Mhm.
I think it is important to have this tracker to document what is happening now and for us to then think about, do we want to rebuild the status quo
Mhm.
or do we want to reimagine something different? Which I'm pro different, like pro better, pro change, pro like if this is what we're going to be working with, it's going to be a completely new phase that we exist in after this administration leaves. I don't know what's going to come next, but at the very least, we should be thinking about how do we use executive action aggressively, but for better ends? You know, is there a way to create a more equal society that takes these lessons, but does it with completely different outcomes in mind? And so, like, when I think about that, it's like, I think it's helpful to track all of the harm, but I also think it was helping me think about what could we be doing
Mhm.
better and differently.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you. I do want to thank you all for joining the conversation, and I would like to close with, one message or one takeaway from today's conversation that you might want to deliver to the broader community.
Oof. I would say go check out the tracker. But really pay attention to what is happening. That's why I liked it. It's just an easier way to pay attention, but use these tools to reimagine a better future.
Mhm. I would say something similar, right? Which is, again, like, obviously, I definitely want folks to go to the tracker and use it. But again, just get your information where you're getting it. Us is one resource that I think you can use that's helpful. But knowing that you want to dive into how you can utilize these resources to create positive change, right? We know that it's really difficult for things to move federally right now. But despite all the challenges with voting engagement, right, people still have an opportunity to go out and vote. And right, so if you have the ability to educate people about
Yes.
how they can do that, make sure you're doing that. If you can kind of help bring people to the polls, that's one way. How you can use this information to help move things at more local levels and state levels is another thing, because we still see opportunities for movement there as well. The fight is not over. It's something that continues, but it takes everybody to think about what is the piece that I can do and how can I help move things forward, because we don't, no one person is going to change any of this. It's going to require all of us, everybody doing little individual things that help to move progress forward for everybody collectively.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for the conversation. I'm going to just quickly add my sort of one suggestion. I would love to see this tracker picked up at local levels by local newspapers, and to see college students and high school students using this, especially as we are thinking about the next generation of community change agents, social change agents, and activists. I would love to see that happen in terms of the use and application of the tracker.
Same here.
Yeah.
Love it.
Thank you.
Well, again, thank you so much for this conversation. You can learn more about the CBCF Executive Order Tracker, understanding what's at stake for Black America, on their website, cbcfinc.org. To listen to this full discussion and learn more about our work on race, prosperity, and inclusion, please visit us at brookings.edu.